Hello everybody, we're delighted to be supporting this event. Prospects provides access to careers advice and opportunities to students and graduates, but we also have a big part of our organisation focusing on labour market intelligence and particularly something called What Do Graduates Do, which is an annual report on the state of the graduate labour market. We've got copies on our stand and you're very welcome to take one away. And this presentation is based really upon the data that we collect in What Do Graduates Do. And it's a presentation that's been known to go on for about 3 hours before now, and I'm going to distill it into 20 minutes and to give us plenty of time for discussion afterwards. And I'm going to do that by really focusing on a handful of what we believe are significant elements and aspects of the graduate labour market as it stands at the moment, and much of which provide some very good talking points. Now, I shall begin with some debunking of things that you often hear about the graduate job market, about students, about universities, etc. Actually, I think a timely way to describe this would be fake news. So these are some of the fake news stories that periodically, it's the kind of thing you hear on the Today programme now and again with a jaded presenter humphing about, well, of course everybody goes to university nowadays, everybody's got a degree. And I think it's a sort of way that people deal with the reality of mass participation in higher education, which of course is a phenomenon, and it's a way that people sort of express and articulate that. Now, fact is, most people in this country have not been to university, and most people in this country won't go to university. So less than half of 14 to 18-year-olds at present probably will not go to university. So it's still not a majority pursuit, if you like. It's a bigger minority pursuit than it's ever been before, but it's still not something that most people will actually end up doing in their lifetimes. And I remember starting my working life in the late 1980s in a sales job in an office, sitting next to an older bloke who said, "Ah, a uni man, is it?" As if that was still something quite unusual to have people certainly going into the sort of telesales jobs. And it was a sort of still something of a curiosity. And they would still ask you questions like, what did you read when you were at university, in that sort of old-fashioned way? And the answer was obviously very little at the time. But those days have sort of disappeared, and it's not entirely true that the aspiration of 50% participation in higher education was written down quickly on the back of an envelope on the way to Downing Street by an education minister in the late 1990s. It's not entirely true. It probably wasn't on an envelope, but it was. It's certainly that was what has been aspired to, but it's unlikely to ever reach that stage. Now, other things that we hear about the labour market, and this is one of these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies to an extent, the idea that graduates only work for big companies, for blue-chip firms, for the large recruiters. Actually, the reality is 35% of graduates of the most recently surveyed group went to work for SMEs, and many of those were working for firms with fewer than 50 people in startups or very small and micro enterprises, etc. So that's a lot of people going into a lot of diverse jobs in what you might call non-traditional graduate employment. The problem, if it is a problem, but certainly the diagnosis, is that much of the language about graduate recruitment and its discourse is mediated through larger firms, through big campaigns, through the larger brands. So inevitably, they tend to sort of dominate the idea in people's minds about what graduate employment is and isn't. Now, the SME question is critical because university career services particularly move heaven and earth to help their graduates to understand and their students to understand that there is a wealth of employment opportunity out there. I mean, SMEs constitute the vast majority of UK employers, and that they do provide phenomenal opportunities for graduates. We ran a survey a few years ago called Real Prospects, which was a survey of graduates actually in work, not who they thought they might want to work for or who they knew about, but who were actually in work. Most of them were working in SMEs, and the general tenor was that, from the respondents, was that I'm working in a job that I didn't even know existed, in a sector I never thought I'd be interested in working in, for a firm of the sort that, you know, in my mind I wasn't a graduate recruiter, but I'm actually learning a lot, I'm doing a lot of movement, I'm getting a great opportunity, etc. So matching up graduates with SME opportunities, this is a perennial question, and if somebody ever cracks that fully, they'll be incredibly wealthy and it will solve a lot of problems. But it's important to know that the reality of graduate employment obviously is not just working for the big firms, that's a big important part of it, but it's actually working for all kinds of employers. Now, another one is the idea that you certainly get outside of London because, well, all the graduate jobs are in London, we're going to have to move, and we'll look in a moment at why that's absolutely not the case. The majority of graduates don't start their careers in London, 1 in 5 do. Obviously, in some sectors, in some industries, the concentration of opportunities is in London and the South East generally. 48% of London working people are graduates compared to 35% outside of London, so clearly it's a heavily concentrated sector and context. But again, thinking back to the SME point and any other sort of factor about the way employers are based, most graduates will not work in London and most jobs aren't based there. This idea is you hear from time to time, was I think something that really came out of the recession, when the idea that there would be what was at the time described as a lost generation of graduates, which is a very unhelpful way of describing the reality of graduate employment at the time. It's quite clear that there are lots of jobs for graduates. So by the latest survey from what the graduates do, there were 189,000 graduates in work from 2014 to 15. 71% of them are working at professional level, in professional level jobs. So it's a vast majority working in jobs. Now, we won't have the discussion about what is and isn't a graduate job, but certainly at professional level. But crucially, and this is something that's potentially eye-opening, there are more workers in professional level jobs in the UK than there actually are graduates. So if we're going to make an exaggerated point about this fact, far from it being there aren't any jobs for graduates, you could actually say there aren't any graduates for jobs. There's still an undersupply of graduates and skilled workers, and this is something that will carry on into the future. There still is huge demand for those sorts of workers. So that's another one to debunk, and I won't ask you to come up too close to scrutinise. This is really not a great slide for public showing, but it proves a very important point. And this is something you do hear a lot nowadays, the idea, well, you're better off not going to university. This is a theme or a meme, if you like, associated, I guess, with things to do with tuition fees, with the extension of other kinds of opportunity, which are all very legitimate points and questions. However, the reality over the last 10 years, which is what this slide shows, is these are unemployment rates for graduates and non-graduates. The line at the top is the unemployment rate for 21 to 30-year-old non-graduates from 2006 until 2015. And their graduate counterparts are the green line, third down. Unemployment for non-graduates historically runs at much higher levels than it does for graduates. Even at the height of the recession, graduate unemployment did not reach levels beyond what that 6 to 7%, what the slide shows. Graduate unemployment is very different to non-graduate unemployment. Graduates generally do not experience mass redundancy, wholesale closures of industries and sectors and communities, because graduates are generally more resilient and versatile and trained and skilled, and they tend to enter better jobs. So from an unemployment point of view, the argument that you're better off not going to university is demonstrably false. So they're the myths debunked and busted. Now, there may not be things that you've even entertained or engaged with, but I mean, we certainly hear these things from time to time. It's useful to be armed with the facts because they point to the very positive and enduring experience of going to university and being a graduate and the value that that brings you in the labour market. Now, general top-level facts about the graduate market right now, and all of this is dealt with in much greater depth and detail in what the graduates do. But more than 300,000 first degrees awarded in 2015. Second point, this is very, very significant. That was almost 26,000 fewer graduates entered the labour market in 2014-15 than they did in 2013-2014. And similar declines are anticipated for the next few years. So there are fewer people leaving university at the moment than there were a few years ago. It's not growing, it's declining, and will continue to do so. But to reinforce the points we've made about unemployment, the unemployment rate now is back to pre-recessionary levels, i.e. pre-2008 and the global financial collapse. And the majority of those workers are in professional level work on permanent contracts. So, jump to hugely important aspect or component of the graduate recruitment debate, which is the importance of regions and regionalisation. It's an obvious point to make, but like the macroeconomy, the graduate labour market is not a single identifiable unit. It's made up of lots of fragmented, overlapping regional, national, local and international sectors and areas. And most graduates, they do one of three things. Either after leaving university, they go home, they stay close to the university they studied, or they go to a large city. Now, they're obvious sort of trajectories, but we'll look in a moment at the statistical reality behind that, because it is actually quite enlightening. But more and more, regional labour markets are going to be critical to understanding things to do with graduate recruitment, graduate opportunities, and for things like planning recruitment campaigns, etc. The impact of devolution and regionalisation, regional government, cannot be underestimated. Now, Andy Burnham, for example, we talk about Manchester because that's where we live and work at Prospects. Andy Burnham, for many people, is somebody who's a potential candidate for the Labour leadership a while back and is a reasonably well-known MP. In the North West, he's almost certainly going to become the first mayor of the Manchester region, a political and economically driven political appointment. He's got an economic agenda which he's got the means to carry out, and that will make a potentially transformative difference to the North West and in all the other regions and so-called powerhouses. And John MacDonald, the Shadow Chancellor, talking the other day about a crossrail for the North and the focus of investment, the government's industrial strategy, which you may have encountered recently, which is taken at face value, an extraordinary document, which is actually like rolling the years back to the late 1970s, because it's a national plan. It's a national plan for restructuring, reinvesting, for skills development, for infrastructure, for creating new authorities, new organisations and agencies, which is effectively tearing up the political orthodoxy of almost 40 years in a very quiet way, and people have rarely commented on it. But assuming that that is implemented, that's hugely significant. So what does that mean for graduate recruiters? Well, it means that you're going to have to think much more about engaging with, which many of you I'm sure are doing anyway, for example, career services in local areas. Heads of careers in various parts of the country are already positioning themselves to be leaders of employability in their regions under sort of devolved government context. So there's going to be lots of new focuses, lots of new areas of energy, of power and influence that you need to tap into, because it is developing, things are balancing or anticipated to be rebalancing much more equally across the nation as a whole, and that's going to have a huge impact. The corollary to that, in terms of the behaviour of graduates, is extremely significant. Because when we look at graduate migration, and when we certainly set it in this context of devolution and regionalisation and greater power in the regions and northern powerhouses, etc., this is fascinating. We identify 4 types of graduate based upon their propensity and behaviour after graduation. And the findings suggest that graduates are much less mobile and much less prone to moving, to migrating, than probably most of us have thought, or certainly would like to think. 45% of all graduates live and have studied and now work in or very close to their own region. They have not left Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, East Anglia. They've studied as close to home as possible. They may even have lived at home whilst they're undergoing that experience, and they're certainly working in that region. That's 45% of all graduates, or approximately, I think, 80 to 83,000 of the working population of graduates. That's extraordinary, because if you're talking about graduate talent, about accessing that talent pool, about understanding where people want to work, about understanding where jobs might be created in your organisations, where investment decisions might be taken, where you actually go to recruit, what networks you use, you need to bear that in mind, because I don't think that figure's going to shift. If anything, this is pure speculation. It might be likely to rise given various socio and economic factors over the next few years. So that's 45% of all graduates. People who've moved to another region to study and stayed, relatively small. The second highest figure is people who moved away and returned home. So again, there's that sort of migrating back to the family nest. That constitutes the majority. Only 19% actually work in a region that they've neither studied in nor were born or brought up in. So this is significant, and I think this cuts potentially to the very heart of your thinking about recruitment campaigns, or could do, because this is what most graduates do. They do not move. They don't move away hugely to university, and they certainly don't move away to work. It makes sense in a human way when you think about it, but it certainly means we may need to adjust our thinking about what graduates are prone to do. As a sidelight to that, and also referring back to the idea of the Northern Powerhouse, we like to show this because those graduates who have neither lived nor studied in the city they were working in 6 months after graduation, it's not London that's the place to go, it's Manchester, far and above. Now, we're not surprised at that, obviously, but certainly when we do this talk in Leeds and Liverpool, it ruffles a few feathers, as you might imagine. But these are factors to do potentially with the size of cities and conurbations and opportunities that are there. So, of that, what if it was the 19% that will move to other places, Manchester is leading the way, but other major cities are obviously benefiting from that as well. Now, top-level stuff, and this is part speculation, part what we know at the moment, and this won't come as any surprise to you, but in the graduate labour market, as in the labour market generally, it's an uncertain period. What will be the terms of our withdrawal from the European Union, how that will actually pan out, issues connected with foreign workers, that will obviously affect certain sectors. Higher education is one particular. I think 17% of all staff in higher education are from outside the UK, the majority from the EU, the health service, but many other areas as well. And the unusually volatile international climate, which I think is a reasonable way of describing the general current of and tempo of things at the moment. Brexit being the main issue still, there's I suppose an identifiable three-part shock to Brexit. There was a result which probably, as it panned out, did not have the severe cataclysmic effect that it was anticipated at the time, but I do remember very well being at the Association of Graduate Recruiters Conference the day after the referendum result was announced, and it was a funereal atmosphere, and it was unbelievable shock. Because the world that we inhabit and the assumptions that we have, and especially those in and around higher education and graduate recruitment, of what is enduring and right and everything else have been turned on their head. So there's an awful lot of shock and uncertainty. The effect of Article 50, the triggering of it, and what the process of that is the second part of the shock. The final one will be the act of leaving itself. It's an important point. I mean, it's a bit academic, but it is a political crisis, primarily, not an economic crisis, but it's obviously got economic ramifications and repercussions, but it's primarily a political crisis. And one of those vague things about the only constancy is flux. The only certainty is the range of uncertainty extremely wide. There's a new phenomenon called TETS, T-E-T-S, which is too early to say. And that's what most people seem to be talking about when it comes to Brexit, certainly. Also about the higher education white paper, also about various other things. But too early to say. The only issue is when that then moves into it's far too late to do anything about it. That's the middle ground that we're all trying to identify at the moment. Business, particularly economic factors being pragmatic, business has adjusted to new dispensation. Bank of England has modestly revised its forecasts, and I would recommend getting hold of the UK Chamber of Commerce survey. The most recent one was talking about pretty good business confidence in terms of investment and job creation in the final quarter of 2016, and anticipating that more jobs will be created amongst their members who were surveyed in the first quarter of 2017. So there's cautious optimism, but it's too early to say. We talked to career services, and the ADCAS themselves surveyed them. 7 out of 10 heads of university career service thought that the labour market in the year up to last summer was more buoyant than the previous year, which is encouraging. Because career services, and heads of service particularly, they're really good barometers of especially the local and regional job markets, and the national one as well. And they know an awful lot about what's going on in their sort of constituencies, if you like. They have phenomenal connectivity with employers as well as with students and graduates. So I think, when they're feeling pretty buoyant, that's not a bad sign, but it's important not to read too much into any of these predictions. And we'll drop this towards the end, and we've already, I suppose, seen the effects of that. The number of 18-year-olds is falling year on year. This is a demographic fact which is too late to do anything about, obviously, and we have to wait until the tide turns. and there are more 18-year-olds entering the university sector. But this has an important consequence. We've seen the number of graduates falling already, and I think what it means is, in terms of how we think about graduate recruitment and the labour market, cannot take it for granted that there will be an eternal pipeline of graduates coming in to fill all the jobs in all the sectors and all the industries and all the skills shortages areas, and that's something we haven't even touched on here, in all the skills shortages areas that we need. Now that will have a severe effect potentially for firms, for the economy generally, and when you harness that to the potential of reduced opportunities for foreign workers, that adds up to something quite serious potentially for the UK economy. Because the other point about Brexit, we've talked about it from an economic point of view and an employer point of view, but actually for graduates, this is a generalisation, but certainly those that we've talked to and many others who've reported, they felt Brexit as a betrayal. That represented to them actually a generational betrayal of their hopes and ambitions and everything they thought was, you know, the world that they were going to move into, a world of mobility and fluidity, a world of harmonious international relations. And actually, many of them potentially will vote with their feet and their passports, and maybe we'll see an increase in the number of British graduates working in Europe or further afield. And if we think also, thinking about what HSBC said a couple of weeks ago about moving their trading operations to Paris if the UK leaves a single market, which constitutes 20% of their entire operation, and other firms follow suit, that will again add a very uncertain and unstable factor to our thoughts about the longer-term health of the economy. And graduates may well be part of that, because graduates are conscious actors in their own economic drama. They're not just components that sort of turn up in statistics like what we're looking at now. They actually help create that world. So that's going to be an interesting thing, and I think, again, we need to think, as recruiters or people interested in graduates in the long term, what can we do to ensure that actually staying in the UK, working in the UK, and committing the rest of your life to the UK is a credible, viable option, and stop them thinking about doing it elsewhere potentially. But we'll finish on just more sort of general trends. You know, having said, notwithstanding some of those factors, I think we do need to be very mindful of. The underlying graduate labour market is pretty stable. We've talked about the industrial strategy for the government, but I mean, you're taking that at face value. That will look to create jobs and infrastructure and opportunities with a regional and skills-based focus. And again, the demand for graduates in that context will be serious and significant. And as before, with recessions and depressions and unemployment bouts and spates, educated, skilled workers get hit less hard than their less educated, less skilled counterparts. And that's a fact of the economy and has been for many, many years. And we've dealt with the international opportunities. We say it's labour market and the graduate labour market is unlikely to see significant improvement. That's not a negative thing. It's unlikely to grow significantly from its presently reasonably stable base. And the fact of, if there is a downturn, the fact of fewer graduates entering the labour market will mitigate the effect of that on graduates, certainly in terms of unemployment. And this is a very sort of anodyne way, in a way, to finish, but it's the best we can always say, I think, about graduate labour market, is that most graduates will get a positive outcome. There's still the link between the investment in terms of skills and time and everything else that they put into their employability generally does pay off for graduates in the end, and that's what most graduates report. It is still a world worth entering and enduring with, and then the outcomes for the economy generally and for employers and for all of us is this supply of skilled, ambitious, educated workers who have something to contribute. And I think obviously that's why we're here today and what we're talking about today, and we should keep that in the forefront of our minds with this. So I'll finish on that point, and I think in terms of things to discuss, I hope one or two items have come out of that. I would definitely say think about the graduate migration trends and what they might mean for you when you take these thoughts back to work tomorrow. So thank you very much.